In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God.
Amen.
Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, on this, the seventh Sunday of Pascha, the Sunday between the Feast of Ascension and Pentecost, we commemorate the fathers of the First Ecumenical Council, the Council at Nicaea in 325. In one sense, this is an arbitrary date chosen to commemorate this. The council itself lasted from May to August in 325. There isn't anything particular that happened on the seventh Sunday of Pascha in 325. But as we reflect on it, we will connect immediately what was going on in the 4th century with all the bishops of the church and the known world gathering together to defend the Orthodox faith against Arianism. We can connect that on the one hand with the Lord who ascended to heaven to take to himself from the Father all authority in heaven and on earth, to reign indeed as the King of creation, the King of new creation. And on the other hand, we can connect it to one Sunday hence, and the descent of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit whom the Lord promised to pour out upon his disciples, upon the church, upon the whole world, that it should be taken up and should be guided into all truth. So Ascension and Pentecost both come together in this commemoration of the Holy Fathers. And yet it's so easy for us to reduce this to something which it's not intended to be. Certainly during the modern period, as we've reflected before, we've reduced faith to rationalistic beliefs. And so this feast in a way becomes simply a feast of us and them, of truth and falsehood, of gatekeeping, of saying who's in and who's out. It becomes, as it were, a feast of a certain kind of faith, a faith that the scriptures don't know anything about, the early church wouldn't recognize. And yet it's the faith we often try to hold, a kind of simplistic, rationalistic, dualistic faith, where God is all sovereign and simply rules all things, and we're on his side and everyone else is against us. Rather, we should be seeing this feast in conjunction with everything we've seen to this point over the last many weeks. The Sundays which led up to Pascha, Sundays of inculcating and nurturing a certain kind of faith in catechumens, preparing for baptism, and in ourselves as we renewed that baptism in the Feast of Feasts, our Lord saving Pascha. And in these Sundays after Pascha, where we have been furthering and developing that faith and understanding it in different dimensions. If this indeed is the feast of the faith of our fathers, it's of a rich and complex and mature kind of faith by this point. We should have a more well-rounded understanding of what that's all about. Now, in our contemporary days, there's been pushback against the faith that has been construed in the last few hundred years, this rationalistic faith. And there's a particular author I would draw to your attention. He's not Orthodox, he's a contemporary Christian theologian and pastor, Brian McLaren. And he speaks of 4 levels of the development of faith. And I think it's worth thinking about this, not only as a new idea, because it's not new, it's a retrieval of the pre-modern understanding of a faith that develops and grows and matures. A faith that is recognizable indeed in the scriptures, especially in the Psalms. A faith that is recognizable in the apostles and the early Christians. And indeed, a faith that is recognizable in the 4th century with the fathers gathered at Nicaea in 325. The first level of faith, McLaren tells us, is the faith of simplicity. It's that faith, indeed, which maps onto what a lot of people in the modern era take to be faith. It's what a lot of people assume religion is. It's simply revealed truth. It's this is right and that is wrong. God reigns, and as long as we follow the word of the properly established authorities, we will be safe, we will be secure, we will be guarded within the battlements of the church, safe from all of everything else that might transpire in the world around. It's a faith of right and wrong, of clean and unclean. It's a faith in which we're worried about transgression, about trespassing on laws and rules and getting things wrong. But if we get things right, or indeed if we get them wrong, there's forgiveness to bring us back. But if we get things right, we're on the right side, and we will be redeemed. The trouble with this kind of faith, though, is it bounces and comes smack up against life. Life begins to happen. And the first thing that happens in our life that challenges this kind of simplistic faith is indeed that we meet other people. We meet others who may or may not share the same simplistic black and white, right and wrong categories we have. And we somehow have to navigate that. We can navigate that by rejecting the people, and sadly this happens more often than not. And we retreat to those people who think alike to us. But we can also begin to complexify our faith and navigate it and encounter others and hear from others and begin to explore other dimensions, other perspectives, other possibilities. The other thing that faith confronts in this stage is the complexity of growing up, of being an adult, of possibly marrying and having children, and all of the things that comes from that. All of the things that life brings to us. And so faith at this stage, rather than being simplistic, rather than being simply black and white categories, faith becomes more pragmatic. It becomes that thing that maybe, if I negotiate it correctly, will help me to become a better person, will help me to order my life, will help me to go in a certain direction. And I think we all recognize this, that this begins to happen. Maybe in our young adulthood, we go from being very, very certain indeed. At 17 or 18, most people know everything and are absolutely sure of those things. But by the time we hit our mid-20s, our late 20s, life begins to shape us in different directions. We become slightly more pragmatic, perhaps. And that pragmatism dominates this second level of faith. We no longer look to authorities to tell us the right and the wrong, the rules that we must follow. The authorities are somehow transformed into coaches, into guides, into mentors that can maybe lead us to something of the good life, something of a life based on values. If we're staying within the Christian church and family, then what we want to do is to have a good Christian marriage, a good Christian family. We want to raise our children in the right direction. Maybe our business, we want to run that along the values of a Christian life. It's a highly pragmatic form of faith. And it's one that if people don't begin to leave the church at this stage, they will continue to follow for many years to come. The third stage of faith, though, happens when life in all of its fullness hits us. In which I mean sickness and suffering and death, all the struggles, the deep and very, very difficult things to negotiate. It's no longer possible simply to say we can bend our simple faith in a kind of pragmatic sense and begin to kind of shape our life around the experiences we're having. At this point, things no longer add up. They no longer make sense. We can't reconcile. God is in his heaven, benevolently looking after every dimension of human life, ordering all things, everything according to his will. When we meet this kind of suffering, this kind of struggle, we begin to be shaken to the very depths of our being. And it's at this point one of a number of different things can happen. For some people, it's the catalyst simply to go running, their tail between their legs, back to stage one faith, back to clinging to certainty, ignoring the reality, sort of thinking that beyond my current existential crisis and experience, I must be getting it wrong. Let me believe the authorities. Let me believe the truths that I was told as a child. Others will simply flee and leave. This is the stage at which most people will just abandon faith altogether. It just doesn't add up. There's no way to process this. There's a world of chaos and confusion and disarray and alienation, and all I can do in that is to kind of chart my own truth, my own destiny, my own purpose. This is the stage of, if people stay within it, of being honest, of being truly authentic to themselves, facing up to inconvenient truths. Whatever it is that shakes our faith, it could be suffering, it could be the experience of abuse in the church, or even facing up to inconvenient truths like racism or the colonialism that the church foisted upon indigenous peoples. And how many people have been shaken in this country just in the last few years, whether it's sex scandals in the church or the treatment of indigenous people. People just give up. There's nothing left here. And yet for those who persist at this stage, two skills, two traits come to the fore. And there are a couple of traits that seem contradictory, but held together are what enable us to continue to develop and mature in the faith. And they are, on the one hand, cynicism, and on the other, mysticism. Cynicism in the sense of a critical stance, a mature, thoughtful, reflective response to religion and to the truths that the authorities have been telling us. A cynicism that says there are no simple answers. It doesn't mean that we can't persist in our trust in a loving God, but the answers we're given don't actually make sense. It's okay to be honest. It's okay to say that. It's okay to lament. As I say, go back to the Psalms. There's an awful lot of that level of cynicism there. God, what are you on about? Why is it that the wicked are prospering? Why is it that your faithful ones are poor and oppressed? It makes no sense. God, if I was in your place, I wouldn't be doing it your way. It doesn't add up. But together with that is a kind of mysticism, a mysticism of seeing that in paradox, in tension, in struggle, there is a kind of emerging truth. Not truth that we clench in our hands and possess, but an openness to growth, an openness to new understanding, new development, an openness to our own struggle towards encounter with the living God. And for those who persist with this cynical mysticism or this mystical cynicism, however you construe that, there is a fourth stage of faith, a stage which McLaren calls harmony. It's a stage of integration. It's a stage where we learn that it's no longer us and them, it's all us. It's all us in an interdependent web and network of life where there is ultimately, despite our rationalistic inability to perceive sense, there is a kind of sense that comes from an encounter with a living God who is indeed, as we celebrate in every liturgy, inexpressible, ineffable, beyond human thought and understanding, and yet still reigns. It's a stage at which we are willing to give everything up for the sake of the purposes that are unfolding under that God's loving care, within his story, within his ongoing and unfolding purposes for rescuing and renewing all of creation. It's a stage at which we truly learn self-sacrificial love and non-discriminatory love towards all. And we integrate. We begin to put the pieces back together. And these stages can't be seen in a way as, steps of a ladder, but rather as the kind of rings that grow out from a tree as it matures. Each of them embracing and somehow integrating the earlier stage. It's not necessarily true that all truths have to be left behind in that certainty sense. We have even to hold at least to enough truth in hand to say the truth in hand is not the end of the story. Without that, we wouldn't even be able to say such a thing. But that maturing faith, like a maturing tree, is one that grows and develops, and despite the slings and arrows of fortune and the sufferings of this life, we begin to integrate and make sense of all things. Now, which of these models makes most sense of this day, of this feast, of the readings even that we have? Which of them makes more sense of what the fathers of the church were doing in the 4th century? Is it that they were simply stage 1 faith leaders, authorities, saying there's one right way and these are the wrong ways, and don't follow the wrong ways, follow our right way, just believe and shut up, just believe and don't do anything with that? Is that indeed what it means, as we say in the Troparion of this feast, that they led us to the true faith? For so many Orthodox, for so many Christians, this is indeed how it seems, that somehow we are weak. We are, for all these crises and experiences that we have, we are somehow less than full Christians. We need to set those aside. Any attention we pay to them, any doubts we experience, are signs that we lack that kind of true faith. We need these guides to take us back to stage 1 faith and certainty in all respects, and that's what this is all about. And when St. Paul says in today's reading from the Acts of the Holy Apostles, in this sort of farewell discourse, as he's on his way to Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, where he says, beware that after me are coming wolves amongst you. They will come and they'll try to take you away from the faith. Men will rise up and they'll distort the gospel. Is that what he's talking about? Come back, listen to me, stage 1 faith? Or if we look more globally at St. Paul's mission about his writings, what is St. Paul always and everywhere about? Just take one of the issues. It's an issue we spoke about many weeks ago in the run-up to Lent. It was that issue of the sacrificing of meat to idols. It's something that comes up a lot in the early church. He refers to it in several of his epistles. We might well imagine the Orthodox canonical response to an issue like that is, by the way, there's a right and a wrong answer. These people are saying, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, either yes or no is the answer to that. But St. Paul doesn't go there. He doesn't say that. He says, and he reframes the whole thing as an issue of freedom of conscience, but above all, love. It's an integrating response. It's a response that carries us up the levels of faith from stage 1, yes and no, there's a right answer, follow the right answer, avoid the wrong answer. He leads us through a pragmatic one about caring within the Christian community for unity, for making sure there's no division, through this level, 3rd stage of perplexity, until finally an image of harmony, of self-sacrificing love, where it doesn't matter in the final analysis. What matters is the brother or sister in front of me and their faith, their conscience, their salvation. I will do whatever I need to do for them. And this is reflected too in St. Paul's great hymn of love in his first epistle to the Corinthians, right? Where he specifically talks about development of faith. After hymning love, what love is, how it's not feigned, how it suffers all things, how it's never ending. He says that when I was a child, stage 1 faith, when I was a child, I reasoned as a child, I thought as a child, I prophesied as a child. But when I grew up, I put away childish things. You know, it's as though we see now in a mirror a dim reflection. But we will see face to face, and we grow towards that in our faith. It's a developmental process. And through these stages of faith, we come until finally, even faith and hope are transcended by love, which is the most important of all 3 of them. St. Paul encourages us. So when he's talking about the wolves who are coming in, he's not talking about people who will take us away from the one right way of seeing things into another right way. In fact, the very word we use for these wolves, these men who come in, heretics, hereses, is telling. It's the word not for wrong teaching. It's the word for choice, for narrowing of truth. It's a word that means limiting truth. And the implication is that the opposite of heresy is not the one right thing, but an expansive and all-encompassing, a paradoxical, held in tension form of truth that is ever developing, ongoing, always suffering, always developing, always maturing. God desires those to be part of his covenant family. God desires people to grow up, to put away their childish things and cling to a mature form of faith and trust and love in him that is no longer limited by constrained and limited rationalistic propositions of truth. And so when St. Paul is warning against the wolves who are coming in, he's warning against that, people limiting us to stage 1 faith. And when the fathers of the church in the 4th century are saying, no, it's not the way Arius is proposing, it's this way, they're inviting us on a journey not to be limited by one other set of words over against Arius's, but a journey that leads to ultimately those words being set aside and to an experience in the infinite love and glory of God himself, into what they call the mystery of faith. Because that's what that mature faith is about. It's moving from simplicity through complexity, through perplexity, and all of those struggles and sufferings, all of those doubts, the doubt that pushes us forward. Doubt is not the enemy of faith. It is that thing that pushes us forward and allows us to question authoritarianism or heresy. Doubt is what leads us forward into the ultimate mystery of the God who is indeed ineffable, incomprehensible, beyond all things, and yet not beyond our participation in his loving and glorious embrace. Amen.